Here I'm going to show you how to automate importing text into Excel, and it works like this. Click a button, find the file on your computer, and click it. And your data is where you want it, how you want it, almost immediately. And I'll show you how to import it into an existing worksheet, also into a new worksheet. And if you don't like this window, where the user has to select it from the computer, I'll show you how to make it so it will automatically get the data from a specific file, so we can skip this step altogether. But if you do want this step, I will also show you how to limit the files that can be viewed to only text files or other files that you want. And if they cancel or close this window, show them a message. No file selected, or whatever message you want to show the user. And doing this does require using macros, but don't worry because I'm going to walk you through every step of it and show you places where you can change things to work for your situation.
Before we start, check the video description and click the link to Teach Excel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.
All right, before we get into the code, I want to show you the data that we're going to be working with. It's a very small sample set of 15 rows, and this is the text file that we are going to be importing. And all of the columns are separated using a tab, but I'm going to show you how to account for other delimiters like a space or a comma or whatever else you need. Now let me barline this, and let us go to the VBA window, Alt F11, and begin. And this is a small part of a much larger tutorial in my full VBA course on teachexcel.com, and the link to that will be in the description of this video. And you can see here a number of additional topics that are covered in the full course, and there's a link to the course here as well. But the import method that I'm going to show you here is quite versatile, and it's going to work in a lot of different situations. And what I have here, by the way, is the final end result of the tutorial if you download this file with all of the notes and all of the comments that add additional explanations for pretty much everything. And I modeled this after the course itself, where there are no bare lines of code. Everything is explained nicely, and the tutorials are used as a reference so that you can come back to it later and figure out what's going on. But let us start fresh. And the first thing that we want to do is to get the file that we want to import. And let's create a variable for that, dim file to open, and we are going to make it a variant so it will work for what we do a little bit later. And let us store the file to open. I'm going to hit Control Space to fill in the variable. Since we declared it there, it allows us to do that. So file to open equals quote quote and the location on your computer. Test sample data, and this one is sales sample 15 rows, and don't forget the extension .txt. And then we just do workbooks.openText. Don't do workbooks.open. OpenText is the one we want because it gives us a few more features for importing text into the workbook. And then a space and just file to open. And that is it. Those 3 lines of code are going to import that text file into Excel. And in fact, we could make this just 1 line of code if we took this right here, and then we just pasted it over this right here. We wouldn't need these 2 lines then. But we're going to build this out later, so we want to have some variables. And now let's run this and see what happens. Hit F5 or play. And we get another workbook that has opened up, and the text file has been imported into it with all of the columns separated already. We didn't even have to tell it to separate them using a tab, and the dates are now seen as actual dates. If I click this and put it to a general, we see the date time serial format, so we know it's a real Excel date. But this is still in the text file that we saw earlier. It's not in our workbook. Look up here, sales sample 15 rows. And we want to get it into this guy over here. And doing all of that is what requires a little bit extra code. So let us close this. Don't save because remember this is the original text file. Go back to the VBA window. And let's get started with processing that text and pulling it into this workbook. And I'm going to create this as a separate kind of module, so just a separate little code section, sample code copy. And I'm telling you that because I'm going to declare some more variables down here, but in the production version of this, what you should be doing is declaring all of your variables at the top of the macro. And that's what I would normally do. But here I just want to make it a little bit more clear what does the importing and what does the processing. And in order to process this, let's create a couple variables. How about WS master for where we want to place the text? And that's going to be a worksheet variable. And then WB, how about text import as a workbook? And that's the workbook we saw where the text was imported into. And now let's get a reference to the text import workbook. And that brings me to how OpenText works. This may sound a little bit confusing if you're not used to using VBA and macros, but workbooks.opentext will not itself return a reference to the workbook that it just opened. So if you are familiar with workbooks.open, if I hit Control I right now, well, you can't see it because it's off the screen, but at the end it says as workbook. This returns a reference to the workbook that it opens, which means that if we used this, we could do something like this. Set WB text import equal to workbooks.open file to open. And don't forget the parentheses around it if you want to set the output to a variable. And this would actually work, by the way. So if I comment that out and now run the code, it's going to work and it's going to look just like what we had a moment ago, but it's going to make it easier for us to reference this text. However, I don't want you to do that because there are more powerful things with OpenText that we're going to be doing shortly. But OpenText does not return a reference to that workbook, which means that to refer to the workbook that it just opened, we must refer to the active workbook. That is the workbook that is on top. And when you open a new workbook, it is then the active workbook. So right here, we're going to open that text file into a new workbook. And right here, we're going to say, hey, that new workbook you just opened, I want to have a reference to it in this variable. And that's going to make it much easier to work with. And it's at this point that I realized that maybe taking these variable declarations and putting them where I told you they belong is a good idea. It works better in the premium course where I copied much of this tutorial from, because by the time you get to this tutorial there, you are quite advanced and it works a little bit better. But here, I want you to see these right next to each other so that you know that they are related. We open it, get the reference, put it right there, and now we can work with it. But now let's get the WS Master worksheet. And I'm going to show you two things to do. So WS Master. The first one is how to put this into a new worksheet. And that's rather simple. Reference the workbook where you want the new worksheet. We want it in this workbook, which is this workbook here with the code in it. That is different than the active workbook, although sometimes they are the same. It can get a little bit confusing, but this workbook always refers to the workbook with the code in it. That's where we want the data to go. So this workbook, and we're going to type worksheets and then .add. And that is going to add a new worksheet and return a reference to that worksheet that we can then store here and use. And now we have the two references that we require, the workbook with the text and the worksheet where we want to place the text. And all we have to do is to copy it from here and paste it right here. So let's go ahead and WB text to import. That's the workbook I want to talk to right now to get the data from it. Where do I want to get the data from? The very first worksheet. There's only going to be one worksheet in it because it is a text file that you have imported into Excel, and text files don't have multiple sheets in them. And let's go with arrange A1 where it's going to start importing the data. And a great little feature of range is right here. It's called current region. It's the same as if you click A1 and hit Control A on your keyboard. So if I go back here, well here just click A3 and hit Control A, it selects all of the contiguous data. And that allows us to use one cell to get reference to the entire imported data set. And then all we're going to do is to copy that range and then go for WS master. That's where we want the data to go, and the range where we want it to go. Let's put this in A1 since it is a new worksheet. And that should get us pretty far for now. We're going to open the data in a workbook and then copy it to a new worksheet in this workbook. Let's go back here. See, we only have one worksheet, the data worksheet. And let's click this button to run the macro. It is still attached to the macro. And you see the workbook open. All of the data has been selected. Now let's go back to our original workbook. And we have sheet 1 and everything is in here. Perfect. Exactly how we want it. Next up, let's make sure that this guy closes. We don't want to see it after we have finished getting our data from it. And to do that, we go down here, we reference the workbook that we want to close, which is WB text import, and we type .close. And if you made any changes to it, then you can save those by typing true here. But we do not want to save any changes that may have been made, so we're going to type false. And now if we go back here and run it, let's go to the data tab, hit import. It's going to open the file, copy the data, paste it in, and then close the file. So this is the only workbook that's open, and we see sheet 2 with all the text. And now we are starting to get a pretty robust import. Now let's take this and let's put it on the worksheet where we want it. So let's say that we don't want it on a new worksheet, we want it on a specific worksheet. Just change WS master, and this is the only thing we have to change, and why variables are amazing to use, by the way, instead of just hard coding text everywhere. So set WS master equal to this workbook dot worksheets, and we want it to go on the data sheet. And now where do we want to place it? Because over here we place it in A1. Well, on the data sheet, we want to place it in A3. Let's go ahead and copy this and delete it. Another reason why you want to use small data sets for testing this, makes it easier to delete and repeat. Go back here, go over here to A1 and change that to A3. And then comment out this line. The downloadable file will include both of these lines along with comments that explain which is which. And now if we go back to the worksheet and hit import, there we go. And now it's time to change a little bit of how we import so that we do not get the header row in here. So we are going to clear this and go back here. Let's just add a little bit of extra space and work with workbooks.OpenText because there are many, many more options. I'm going to use underscore right here, so space underscore, and then that allows me to go to the very next line. I'm going to use named argument, so it's a little bit easier to see what is what. This is file name, colon equals, go to the end, comma, space, underscore, enter. And now we are going to use the great start row argument. It just makes it so easy to skip rows. So which row do we want to start the import on? By default, it starts it at 1, which is why we got the headers when we imported it. But we don't need headers on our data worksheet. We already have them. So let's change 1 to 2, and now that won't be imported. And let's go to the next one. Even though it does a pretty good job of figuring out how to separate the columns, it is not a good idea to let Excel guess if you want things to be automated, because invariably, eventually, it's going to guess wrong and cause some problems. So what we want to do here is to set the data type to XL delimited. And technically you don't need to do that, it's the default, but I like to do it just to make it clear that these are not fixed width columns. And the next thing is to tell it what delimiter to use. And the OpenText method actually has all of the delimiters as arguments, or not all of them, but all of the commonly used ones. You can see a couple of them at the very end right here, tab and semicolon. And it goes off the screen to say comma and space. And those are the 4 main ones. And to use it, you just type the name of the argument, tab, colon, equals, true, because our columns are separated using tabs. And if your delimiter was not a tab, semicolon, comma, or space, then what you would do, you would not have tab equals true. You would use the other argument, and you would set that to true. And then you would also use the other char for other character argument and put your delimiter in here. But as you can see, there are many, many arguments for workbooks.OpenText, and they make importing a little bit easier, especially with a start row. And I do want to say that it's just off the screen right now, but there is a field info argument, which is a terrifically helpful argument where you can say how you want to import specific columns, and it's great for importing dates. It's a little bit too much to include in this tutorial, but I do include a thorough explanation of how to use it in the premium course, because it's not so simple as inputting true or false. We actually have to use an array within an array. So it's an array of arrays in order to do that, and it's rather tricky, but it can be quite helpful, I have to say. But for now, let's stick with this and get this working. So we have our file name, start row, data type, and tab equals true. And we are good to go. Now let's go back to the data worksheet and test it out. This time we should not get any headers. Hit import, and there we go. No headers, perfectly placed where we want it. But we are not done yet. Let us get that annoying flicker away. So watch when I click import now. You're going to see that where it pops up, that can be kind of annoying. So let us get that away. And this will actually make the macro faster as well. What we are going to do is a little trick you may have heard of, application.screenUpdating equals false. That means that the Excel screen is not going to update while the macro is running. And then we are going to go down to the end of the macro, application.screenUpdating equals true, and turn it back on down there. So those two little lines of code, change it from what it was just a moment ago to, well, let's make it so we can see a change this time. This right here. You don't see the other workbook open, you just see the text magically copy in. And now it's time to get back the file selection window, where we were able to click the import button and then choose the file from the computer. Back to the VBA window, Alt F11, and all we really have to change is how file to open is gotten. So instead of a hard-coded string, we are going to fill it using GetOpenFilename. So file to open is now equal to application.getOpenFilename. And this is the most basic version of it, and it should now work. So let us clear this out. Go to import, and look at that. Isn't it great? Select the file, and it imports right here. Perfect. But there are a number of things that we need to take care of. So what if the user hits import, but then cancel? Sorry, we couldn't find C test sample data false.xlsx. Is it possible it was moved, renamed, or deleted? So what it has done is taken the result returned from GetOpenFilename, which was false, and then tried to open it. And we need to take care of that as well as one more thing. Look down here, it now says all files. And we do not want the user to be able to select all file types because they will eventually select the wrong file type. We want to limit it to text files. So we are as well going to fix that and the error that's about to pop up again. The first error is very easy to fix and is also why we set file to open as a variant instead of a string, because it's going to return either true or false, a Boolean value, which means a true or a false value, or it's going to return this for the file that the user selected. So all we do is check if file to open equals false, then, and let's do an else, and let's go all the way down here, and we're going to pop a little end if right there. So we're going to enclose everything in the if statement so that none of this will run if the user cancels the input. But we do want to do something if they cancel the input. So input canceled, or file selection canceled. And this is where we have our little message to the user, no file selected, or whatever you want to put here. Else, input was not canceled. Let's say we have a file to open. And then we run all of this. So if we go back here now, hit import, and then cancel, no file selected, and we don't see that ugly error message. Perfect. But we still allow the user to select all files. So let us fix that now. And we are going to add another variable for that, dim file filter pattern as string. And this one is a little bit complex, but only because the syntax for it is a bit goofy. So we're going to set file filter pattern equal to, and then quotation mark, and we type what we want the user to see, text files, and then we type the extensions that we want to allow them to select. So I want to allow them to select .txt, then any other extensions? Yes, how about a CSV? So a semicolon, and then another asterisk, period, and then the file extension .csv, close that up, comma, asterisk, period, .txt, semicolon, then asterisk, period, CSV. and close quote. Now in my premium course, I have a full explanation of how to use this syntax in many different ways, as well as opening multiple files at once and doing lots of very interesting things with GetOpenFilename and also choosing the save file name. But as far as this is concerned, we are now going to have a file filter pattern that we can feed to the GetOpenFilename method. And all we have to do, open and closing parentheses, you need that when you want the output from a method to go into a variable. Control I to see the list of arguments or parameters, and then file filter is the very first one. So all we have to do is to paste that in there, file filter pattern. And of course, you don't have to store it in a separate variable like this. You could hard code the text here into the GetOpenFilename, but if you use other arguments, it makes it a little bit annoying to manage all of that, especially if you use much larger file filter patterns. But believe it or not, we are actually finished with the full complete file import macro. Now let's go back to the worksheet and test it out, Alt F11. And the last thing that you want to do when you've created your buttons and your worksheet and made it look really nice is to attach the button to the macro. Right click it and go to Assign Macro. Select the macro, hit OK. And now you have a button to trigger everything. Let us get this out of here and test the final result. Hit Import. Now let us cancel. No file selected. Perfect. Import. Now look down here, text files. I click down and I can't see any other options. We cannot select all file types, only text files. And if you have your computer set up to show file extensions, then you are going to see the .txt and .csv file extensions down here as well. But now the setting prevents the user from seeing any file other than the text files. Then they go to select them. And notice there's a file with 120,000 rows as well. The premium course really kicks things up a notch. But here, let's stick with our 15 rows. And hit open. And there we go. The full final result. And if you wanted to import multiple files, which I cover in the premium course, then you could just stack these one on top of the other. And all you have to do for that is to find the next empty row and then paste in the data from the next text file. And you can slice and dice and process and filter and exclude rows and data from this data set a million different ways. But as you can see with the length of this tutorial already, it gets quite complex, and we very quickly go into arrays, which are a rather complex and sophisticated topic. And in the premium course, by the time you get to the import tutorial here, you know how to use arrays very well, and I show you some very powerful techniques for processing the data before it hits the worksheet so that you don't even have to get all the data. Maybe you only want to get the type of B's in here. Then that's what we're going to do. But you now have a base from which to make a nice and a robust import macro. And I urge you to download this file and to use it and to build out whatever import macro you need from it.
I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.